I'm recording.
So testing the mental capacity when we are talking about mental education.
Yes. We still have to
Capacity,
educate mentally ourselves, yes.
capacity of attention and concentration. We'll just wait for Julian to talk about it.
Sorry, I was going through my bookshelf and thought I would do a commercial.
Yay. Good.
Seen that one somewhere before.
Thank you all for joining us. So today we'll discuss about mental education, and I'll have Martha read about what Shravinda said.
I didn't have to go as far as my bookshelf.
Okay, so we'll unmute and Martha will.
Well, thank you. I'm going to read from The Mother on Education, part of the writing on mental education. Of all lines of education, mental education is the most widely known and practiced. Yet, except in a few rare cases, there are gaps which make it something very incomplete and in the end quite insufficient. A true mental education, which will prepare man for a higher life, has 5 principal phases. Normally, these phases follow one after another, but in exceptional individuals, they may alternate or even proceed simultaneously. These 5 phases, in brief, are 1. Development of the power of concentration, the capacity of attention. 2. Development of the capacities of expansion, widening, complexity, and richness. 3. Organization of one's ideas around a central idea, a high ideal or supremely luminous idea that will serve as a guide in life. 4. Thought control, rejection of undesirable thoughts, to become able to think only what one wants and when one wants. 5. Development of mental silence, perfect calm, and a more and more total receptivity to inspirations coming from the higher regions of the being. Undeniably, what most impedes mental progress in children is the constant dispersion of their thoughts. Their thoughts flutter hither and thither like butterflies, and they have to make a great effort to fix them. Yet this capacity is latent in them, for when you succeed in arousing their interest, they're capable of a good deal of attention. By his ingenuity, therefore, the educator will gradually help the child to become more capable of a sustained effort of attention and a faculty of more and more complete absorption in the work at hand. All methods that can develop this faculty of attention, from games to rewards, are good and can all be utilized according to the need and the circumstances. But it is the psychological action that is most important, and the sovereign method is to arouse in the child an interest in what you want to teach him, a liking for work, a will to progress. To love to learn is the most precious gift that one can give a child. To love to learn always and everywhere, so that all circumstances, all happenings in life may be constantly renewed opportunities for learning more and always more.
Want to share your views?
Particularly when I was rereading this was the importance of experience of the natural environment for all of us, and especially for young people. Life in nature.
Martha, I think your microphone is somewhere. I almost don't hear you.
All right.
Is it on your?
Something is rubbing against it, Martha.
Yeah.
That
How about now?
It's very low, but it doesn't rub at least.
Okay, thank you. Maybe it was my paper.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So apologies, but I feel particularly that experience of the natural environment is very important for learning as well as for health, and that for young people or people of all ages, it does help develop the power of concentration to be out in nature. This can happen either through the study of specific acts of nature, aspects of nature, or simply by the fact that there seem to be fewer distractions, at least material man-made distractions. One of the things that came to mind for me, particularly for studying in nature, is the opportunity to learn to distinguish and concentrate on what the natural world gives to us. For example, studying species of birds. Whatever a child or an individual of any age is interested in, studying birds, trees, rocks, anything, this will help develop the power of concentration, because there's a classification system that you can get into. Things have names. So that can be very helpful. For one of the other statements that Mother makes about expansion, widening, complexity, and richness, what more is there that can reveal this to us than the natural world? There's vast wideness, vast complexity, and vast richness. And then also for mental silence, without the distractions of the artificial elements that we've brought into our world through human creation, we can better develop a mental silence, and being out in nature is very conducive to that. So those were my initial thoughts on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Chaitanya, you want to share? You're muted, Chaitanya.
Martha, I was interested in your using bird observations as the example of being out in the natural world, because I was reminded of Annie Lamott's book Bird by Bird, which she published in the 1990s, when her son, who was 7, said, "I have to count all the birds. How am I going to do it?" And she said, "Bird by bird." So as a guide to being in nature, but also expanding that to what it meant to be a writer. This is one of those books that everybody who writes loves, because she just lays it out, how that grows out of the what the ethicists say for ethical action is awareness, attention, action. So I love the way you started your commentary. That was great. That's all.
So I can completely relate to what Martha just mentioned about studying through nature and developing one's power of concentration through it, because I see it with my son. So he's not somebody who can sit, you can't make him write something or anything that is in the very traditional sense. So every day I take him out in nature for 1 or 2 hours, literally, because we are very fortunate to have that just back door. We can go on the trail. So, and the best way I can teach him is through that. And I know how quiet and poised he is when he's in nature. And all that you had mentioned about how the mother says the 5-point, the phases, maybe not everything, but some things of expansion is something that I can see through him when I see him in nature, and how quiet and observant he is listening to things. And it's incredible how he's able to spot things that I would have never spotted. While walking, I would just be walking and he would stop me almost every few steps to show me something. So it's definitely one of the, I think learning through being in nature is something that is wonderful for a child. yes, to start with. The other thing that struck me was one thing about that we notice in children is their associative power is so strong. They're so good with associating with things. So very often, like if I make him do something, I try sometimes because he's going to go to kindergarten. So I put him in some classes where he learns a little of writing and all, which he doesn't enjoy doing with me, but he loves doing everything else. So I see whenever I try something like a worksheet, it doesn't work with him, of course, because he likes all creative and interesting things. But it's very easy for me to teach him with association. Like, in fact, he would only point out, like he would go out, look at something, he would look at a branch and he would say, that looks like a K. So, you know, it's again with nature and how they associate things, looking at things with pictures and space. And it's amazing how you can teach them. The other thing that I thought was very important is Mother also talks about make use of every opportunity that presents itself to keep the child's thought wakeful, alert, and prompt. And I feel I don't have to try really hard to make him learn, because the opportunity is something that is there at every moment with him, and that with every child. So it's, I think when it becomes challenging is when we are trying to find the opportunity, whereas make use of their own opportunity that they bring. Because at every point he would ask me a question or show me something. And if you can take their lead and, you know, make them see through their interest, it's amazing how the child can learn to concentrate and pay attention. Yeah, that's from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaitanya. Meera, you want to share your views?
Hi, I was just going through the book, and then I think, as Martha said, that the children, you know, I think it's nice for them to develop the will for progress and make every circumstance a possible way of progressing. And then imagination is something that is, you know, the children find joy in imagination, and we can give them several opportunities to imagine and think, and then they grow through imagination. And also they talk about studying different subjects, but also studying different aspects of the, you know, different ways of approaching the subject. And then, you know, and then the problems can be solved in different ways. And so the children learn to be less rigid, and because there are so many ways of solving the same problem. And also, you know, and then we have so many thoughts in their mind, and then it's nice to have a central idea and organize all your thoughts around that central idea, and that'll make the education richer, I feel. And so thank you. That's for me.
Thank you. Andrea, you want to share?
I was struck by Chaitu's description of her son, because of course I see that in my grandson as well. What the mother said was that these concentrations and these enthusiasms are latent, and they arise when kids are engaged. That gives them the will to progress. I think every human being is curious about something, and you really have to beat it out of people and give them worksheets all the time before they give up and say, okay, whatever you want. Because I think every time I have worked with a student individually, and we have freedom to decide what direction to go in, we've always found something interesting to the student. I'm working with a 14-year-old right now, who's a young man who is reading and writing with me, but he's interested in science. So I was trying to give him a journal prompt to write about, and he said, "Nah, I don't want to write about that." I said, "Well, what are you interested in? What would you like to write about?" And he said, "I really want to know how stealth planes work." I said, "Okay, go for it." He wrote 2 pages with diagrams about why the geometry of a stealth plane makes it invisible to radar. I was glad I came to school because I didn't know all that. And true, he found it in Wikipedia and some other online sources, but that was really interesting to him. And that's what he wanted to talk about. He wrote twice as much as he ordinarily writes. Next week he wrote on how bullet trains work. So I don't know what's going to be next. But that thing about being engaged and drawing out the latent will to progress is absolutely true. And it's just a matter of kind of staying out of their way and pointing them in a direction that might be useful, but when it's not, showing them another one, I think.
Thank you, Andrea. David, you want?
So my comments will echo Andrea to some extent, since I agree with that. I appreciate Mother's description of these 5 categories, because I think it's a very helpful description of the territory of mental development in human beings. I really don't see it as linear to the extent that she says. She says only exceptional individuals. I think the capacity exists in all human beings for the unfoldment to take place in a relatively non-linear way, and that the unfoldment of mental capacities to a large extent is really dependent on the extent to which the child is invited to follow her own or his own inner teacher or his own soul guidance. And that's something that begins at birth or maybe before birth and continues throughout the the years of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood for that matter. So, my belief is that there is this universal capacity in the species that we have not yet learned how to tap. We see it in individuals, and you read about particular geniuses who were never schooled. And I've known a couple. I've had the pleasure of knowing a couple, actually. I'm not one of them. And I was a little taken aback on to love to learn is the most precious gift that one can give to a child. I don't think you can give it to a child. I think, or maybe you give it to a child by not destroying it. Maybe that's what she means. We don't have her here to ask. So, but that capacity, again, I think is universal. It's innate. And some of it obviously has to do with the environment that's provided. And, if you don't have decent food, if you don't have decent care, if you don't have the capacity to be safe and so on and so on, obviously there's a lot that goes into the environment. And there are many, many, many children, unfortunately, on the planet who are growing up, not just in explicitly repressive families, where the parenting approach is breaking the will of the child, which unfortunately exists in many cultures still. But there are many children that are growing up in situations where there's an enormous amount of stress, there's fear, there's not enough food. And so this all hinders the unfoldment, the potential for unfoldment of mental capacities. But when there is that wonderful combination of safe, physical, healthy, and mature parents and family members who, really to a large extent, because it's not all or nothing, but to a large extent invite the child to unfold, what I see is children who are really curious or passionate or at times obsessive, and obsessive is a word that has negative connotations. But just to use Andrea's example, if this young man, this teenager, gets really interested in a variety of engineering problems and spends a lot of time learning about them, that sounds like a really good thing to me, because it's a pathway to a lot of other kinds of learning, as well as a potential, understanding of one's calling as an adult. So those are a couple of different comments about this. But again, just to go back to the 5 categories that she describes, I think are really, really helpful.
Thank you, David. Jillian?
Yes, the discussion brought back in my memory 2 things: this motivation and how far the current system is from the kind of education we want. And I was thinking of Ivan Illich and the motivations to learn. And you know, we have this love of learning, an innate love of learning, and to protect that was promoting self-esteem, and to be a lifelong learner was part of my work with Margaret Scutch at the Early Learning Center in Stanford. And certainly that's one of the premises of Oroville, to be a place of unending education. So it's built in, and to keep into that ideals of Oroville and the society they're trying to promote. And it was so beautiful that Heidi could bring her perspectives that dovetailed so beautifully with what Oroville was trying to do, Heidi Watts, that is. And the description of Udar Pinto describing the Shurabendo International Center of Education, saying that they did not start teaching physics per se, but took, like the stealth fighter, the children's interest in submarines, to talk about pressure and decompression and all of the physics involved in the submarine. But it started with this love of wanting to know how submarines worked. And then just that motivation, as Illich was talking about, you show people that you can gain political power through language and through education, that you show students that by following their interest in submarines, that filtering air and power systems, diesel and atomic, and the whole idea of what it takes to go and survive at incredible pressures and come back up. And you have a whole curriculum coming out of that original inspiration. And I remember that from Udar Pinto talking about the school that Mother started in Pondicherry, and that was very much part of their experience and curriculum.
You know, David, I was really interested in your comments because there are 2 recent books that demonstrate how hard it is to actually repress the need to know and the desire to know. One is Educated by Tara Westover, and the other is Unorthodox by Deborah Feldmer. Both young women in very repressive, very much controlled situations who just didn't respond well to it, said, well, something else for me. So I really agree that this is sort of innate. You can wreck it, but it takes a lot. You really can. And I was struck by the phrase gift to the child as well. I agree with you. I think it's, no, don't put a spanner in the works. Just move to the side a little bit and make sure they don't run over the edge, you know? So thanks for that.
You can also recover, you know, that inspiration to learn. And I don't know the 2 books, although I've read reviews of them, but what makes me think of even going back to Jonathan Kozol, Death at an Early Age. And, you know, he talks about the racist, classist, repressive nature of this elementary school that he naively gets hired to teach in Boston in whatever, 62 or whatever. And he begins to basically ignore what they're doing, what they're normatively doing there, and figure out a way to get these, I think it was 4th graders, African-American, primarily African-American or entirely, to find something that interests them. And of course, once he gets that going, you know, they fire him.
Right.
You know,
I read that when I was in college, and it inspired my teaching. I remember
Mhm.
what he said about the year after, when one of his kids came back and said, it's terrible again. He said, well, what's wrong? He said, one good year is not enough. It was just a heartbreaking kind of line. I thought, I was going to go out and reform education, but instead I just taught school.
You reformed education one class at a time.
Well, just to say one more thing about that, if you're familiar with the work of Deborah Meyer in the Central Park East schools in Manhattan, she had this opportunity. She was a kindergarten teacher, and she had this opportunity to create an elementary school in East Harlem around 1980, which she did with many other great folks, and created an incredibly successful school because it started with the socio-emotional well-being of the kids and their families. And then what happened was she found out when the kids went to junior high, after, normal junior highs in New York, they fell apart because the junior highs were repressive and racist. And so then she started the secondary school. And so had for, 15 or 18 years, there was a system where you could enter in kindergarten in Central Park East School and go through 12th grade. If you've ever interested, Fred Wiseman, the documentary filmmaker, shows Central Park Secondary School in the High School 2 movie, which is an incredible portrait of transforming a public high school in America, that really works for low-income kids in East Harlem, who are primarily, African-American and Puerto Rican. It's a pretty amazing film. And what they demonstrated, she didn't do it alone, was that children who entered her school in kindergarten and stayed for the 13 years, that 99% of them graduated on time, and 95% of them went off to four-year colleges, mostly with full scholarships. I mean, the research was done, by the professors at Columbia who were connected to this. And, but the key to the whole thing was the capacity of the people in the school to have regard and respect and love for the families, not just the kids, but the parents as well, and create this community experience. And the movie shows that, if you ever have a chance to see it.
What's the title of the movie?
It's just High School 2. He did High School 1 in the 60s, which basically showed a middle-class high school in Philadelphia, which is probably the kind of high school that I went to. I'm sure Andrew, probably you and Julian and Martha, we probably all went to the same kind of, you didn't, Julian, so.
I did. I went to a suburban high school that had its own issues. I'm interested in that account though, because in the 70s, NAIS put forth an initiative about middle schools. It was mostly run by John Arnold and Chris Stevenson. And I went and followed them around for years, listening to their accounts of their own construction of curriculum and community along these lines. Their documentary showed one of the most charming pieces of film I've ever seen. I think I mentioned this before, of two girls in a field playing horse. They just were middle schoolers and they were free to do what they wanted. But that idea that you need to engage the kids in a way that, as Julian says, where their interest is, and bring them along, fits perfectly in the developmental model that Mother has lined out. I really like it. I'll look up High School 2. That sounds good. Lovely.
Just to say one more thing about it, what was so interesting about Central Park East, and in some ways it did remind me of the Sri Aurobindo Center for Education at the ashram, was that the pedagogy was not the primary thing. The pedagogy at Central Park East, my perception, at least in my experience at the ashram, was that there were multiple pedagogies that different teachers and instructors employed, and that they were attached to their own approaches. And some of the pedagogies were quite traditional. And in the Central Park East School, secondary school, some of the pedagogy, some of the teaching is very teacher-centered, very traditional. Not, you know, some of it is not. But I think what it highlights in both cases, you know, when I interviewed teachers at the Sri Aurobindo International Center, what they told me was that really, what was really, you know, central was the soul-to-soul connection. And that's not the language they used in Central Park East, of course, but it's really what they were doing. You know, it's really the profound social, they would use the word social emotional connection, the profound connection of human beings with each other.
You remind me very much about the Philadelphia experiment in the 70s, the School Without Walls. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So I visited that school. I was in Philly for another reason, and I spent a week with them. And it was marvelous. They had classes all over the city, and the kids were terrific. And I was talking to one of the teachers, and he says, doesn't really make any difference. It's just the scale. It is just getting it small enough so you know the people you're with. I thought, there's a piece of truth. You know, so it's really amazing to me how many experiments we have engaged with across the decades, let's say the last 40 years. It's terrible that they haven't caught on more. Just, it's enough to make you weep.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, everyone. Marco, would you like to share?
Well, yes, I think almost everything has already been said, though, that I agree with, and that these things were also my thoughts. Perhaps just a little parenthesis about this idea of experiencing, going out in nature and experiencing the natural environment, which I agree very much with. I think it's one of the key things, not only for education, but I suppose for the survival of humanity as a whole. This possibility to regain a contact with nature. This is badly missing in our society, much more than we are aware of. I lived for almost all my life in big cities and had no idea about that. It's only now, slowly, that I'm gaining this contact with nature, because now I have this possibility to live in a place where there are a little bit of woods and not so much cement, and it's not so big city. But I think we have no idea what the contact with nature is. This is something that has been completely lost in our, except perhaps in some ethnic groups like American Indians, or I don't know about that, but except these things. And so this is badly needed, but I think we must become aware of this, and most educational systems and also teachers and also parents are not aware of this. And in fact, I go into the woods and I'm almost completely alone. I don't meet families, I don't meet people, almost. They are still there in their homes, and maybe it's wonderful weather. It's not a working day, that children don't have to go to school, but yet they are not out in nature. And fortunately, there now in Germany, at least, I think in the US there is also something like that. There are these schools, nature schools, wood schools, where children can learn and pass their time in nature, if they can afford it, because if you're in a big city, you cannot. No? But they had hard times to convince the authorities to get a permission, because the question was, well, they're in the woods and they're in nature, and what do they learn? Because there is still this mindset that you must learn very theoretically, something bookish, with books, making exercises on a piece of paper. And well, now they had got finally the permission, and there are several such kind of schools, but it's just an example to underline, to point out how we have also to change our mind as adults, as teachers, as parents. Because if we have these ideas fixed in our head, and this kind of learning, and we don't regain this contact with nature, I'm afraid this cannot be realized. So this was perhaps my thoughts about that.
Thank you.
One positive manifestation in the U.S. now is that there is a kind of a nature preschool, nature kindergarten movement in the U.S. that's underway. And one of my actually former students from the Self-Design Graduate Institute, she had a child, she was in Houston, and she had a child, 2014, I think. And so when he was 3, she started a nature preschool, and this also became her master's thesis, and basically rounded up, 10 or 15 other families. And 3 years later, when she completed the master's thesis, there was a network of 350 families that had she didn't recruit them. They just showed up when people heard about this, and she had moved into, having different groups. Obviously not, you didn't have 353-year-olds together, but, had all these different groups, and was, trying to decide, whether she wanted to do this as a business or, just hand it off to somebody. But clearly what, was surprising to me, because I don't think of Houston, as being the most natural place in the world by any means, but there was a real, profound response. And so I've read about that in some other places in the U.S. And, so maybe this will, lead to some of the kind of movement, Marco, that you're describing. So.
Yeah, thank you all. And yeah, one thing I feel, especially now with the virtual learning and everything, but if we can help them to develop these faculties of attention, awareness, and concentration, and maybe they will be prepared, and all of us will be prepared to kind of adapt to the situations and make the best use of where we are. And that's one way New Creation International is trying to offer through awareness to the body, so. And I think having adults in that state of mind, or enriching those faculties, will help the children. So thank you all.
Thank you, Lakshmi.
Oh,
Thanks,
yeah.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We will meet next first Wednesday, and we have, we'll talk, maybe we'll combine psychic and spiritual education into spiritual education. If you put psychic, a lot of people will think it's another.
Follow your lead.
Oh, no, everybody, all of you,
Yes.
with your experience.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank
I have
you.
uploaded the YouTube into one of our videos into the YouTube channel.